Greetings, Internet. Welcome to Deploy Friday, the Platform.sh show, where we talk about cool things in tech with interesting people or interesting things in tech with cool people. One or the other, you decide. Today, we're kicking off a new mini-series. We're going to be talking with experts in each of the languages that Platform.sh supports. We're a polyglot host. We support a variety of different languages. And sorry, my audio just went off crazy on me. So we're going to be we support a number of different languages on Platform. And so we're going to take a tour of all of those. Today is our first language. We're talking about JavaScript. And here with us today is Jessica Keener, a JavaScript developer who will be talking with us. We originally were going to have her joined by Aman Verk. Unfortunately, he could not make it at the last minute. So we have a special guest star, Jessica's husband, Austin, who is also a JavaScript developer, will be joining us. So this is the Keener show today. And on the Platform side, I'm joined by Thomas Lattimore, who's a product engineer here at Platform. Say hi to everyone, Thomas.
Hey everyone, glad to be here.
So let's start with some introductions. Jessica, since you're the official guest, you go first. Who are you? What do you do with JavaScript?
So I'm Jessica Keener, and I have been developing with JavaScript since, let's just say I can remember the time that jQuery was very exciting. So it's been a very long time. So I've been through the, oh gosh, JavaScript was so terrible to work with and frustrating, and then the like, oh my gosh, jQuery, it saved us all, and then kind of full circle to, oh thank goodness, JavaScript has caught up, and now we can use it on the platform side and not. I've been a polyglot developer that whole time, so I've been working with JavaScript a whole lot, very heavy front ends, doing mobile development, app development. I've done a lot of platform stuff in like Java, .NET, now some Python, so kind of all over the place, but definitely have always anchored back to JavaScript.
And Austin, how about you? What's your JavaScript story?
All right, so I'm Austin Keener. I've been working in JavaScript since only about 2017, but I also am polyglot in regards to JavaScript, C#, Java as well, Python, and a variety of others. I've been mostly focused on front end here recently, but at my company, we use JavaScript through the entire stack. So we use AWS and we write Node Lambdas and we write Node backends with Express. And then we have consumer facing websites written in Vue and React. So we have JavaScript throughout the entire stack and I use it on a day-to-day basis.
Cool. So at this point in the web, I think it's safe to say everyone has heard of JavaScript. Most people have probably touched JavaScript somewhere, but not necessarily in detail. And yeah, I'm originally a PHP developer, so I'm used to people talking about a language that doesn't exist anymore when talking about their language. What would you say is the biggest misconception that people have about modern JavaScript here in 2020?
So my thinking is probably that it's very loosey-goosey, and there's no structure around it. It's all over the place. Trying to get started is like trying to find a needle in a haystack because there's just so many ways to do it. And if you Google anything about it, that is in some ways confirmed. There are definitely lots of frameworks and lots of opinions about it, but I do think that getting started on it is not that big of a deal. There are very simple tutorials that you can follow to get started and get going. And I mean, really, sure, JavaScript is definitely very loosely typed, but there is a lot that's come up around the community to allow that to be more strongly typed for people that are Java folks or whatever that really don't feel comfortable just slapping some objects in there and calling it a day. So I do think that that's probably one of the bigger misconceptions I see for people that are starting with JavaScript.
Right, and to pair with that, one of the things that I notice whenever developers are coming from some of the languages like Java and C# is the asynchronous model. They don't quite wrap their head around it immediately, in that there's a lot of blogs out there that will tell you that JavaScript is single-threaded, and that immediately makes someone think that it's completely synchronous, when in fact it's not. The misconception then becomes that you can't do a lot in it because everything has to happen in lockstep one after another, where when you actually break down how JavaScript works, it's essentially just pieces of work that happen and then they pause and another one picks up and keeps going through the event model or the event loop. And a lot of people have a problem wrapping their head around that from the beginning, so they never really dive into some of the complexities and cool things that you can do with JavaScript because they think it's going to be too limiting.
And slow.
And slow, which it's not.
No, it's not.
Yeah, we could easily spend the entire time talking about the async model. That's a field unto itself. So, but let's go down that rabbit hole just a little bit. So for people who are not used to asynchronous code, because not every language supports that, what does that mean at a conceptual level, and how does it specifically play out in JavaScript?
So conceptually, it really just, most languages at least have this concept of threading. Like you can spin up a thread and you can go do a thing, and either it'll take off on its own and be done and you don't worry about it again, or it'll come back and it'll give you some information and you can continue. JavaScript has that same concept. It's just a little more baked into the language. And a lot of that really comes from making API calls where you might go out, get something from an API and come back. And if you're not accustomed to JavaScript, that happens asynchronously immediately, and you have to tell it, no, wait for that, and then do this other thing. And so that's like a thing that's immediately frustrating for people. And it's really not that hard to work around once you understand that's what it's doing. But I think that's kind of conceptually where people get a little confused.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to the threading conversation for a second, like a great example is Java. If you're used to working in Java, the request model is completely synchronous, and the way that you make it asynchronous is you explicitly spin up a new thread. Whereas in JavaScript, you say, hey, make this request, and older JavaScript is going to get a call back with the response for that request. But whenever you're creating these essentially contexts that need to be actually executed, they're all going into this queue that gets picked up and gets run back on that thread. So while it is single-threaded, you still get all of the asynchronous of it, because each piece is broken up instead of it being this one long continuous thread of execution that needs to happen. And that can cause people a little bit of some question marks to pop up, like, I don't understand, because it's different than the majority of other language asynchronous models.
Mm-hmm. So you really, in my experience, again, I'm used to working in a synchronous language, but I've done some JavaScript. You really have to approach the language in a completely different way when you're dealing with async. You have to structure your code as a pipeline of operations and just hand over that control to the engine to say, and I don't care kind of their order, just do your thing,
right,
and let go of that part of it. Is that a decent description? So
I think it is. There are definitely plenty of things that are very like, shoot this off into the ether and forget it. And you do need to make sure and keep in mind a piping mechanism. So yeah, I think that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that makes sense.
okay.
So if I could jump in here, what are some common functions that someone may not even realize are necessarily asynchronous that's new to JavaScript? Like, what are a couple functions that may surprise some people when they're new to the language that they weren't expecting to be asynchronous?
I think one of the ones for me when I very first started working in JavaScript, honestly, was set timeout. Because I had worked in Java for like 7 years before that, and there is thread.sleep, which I mean essentially just says stop doing anything for X amount of time. So I was like, okay, set timeout, same thing, right? No, completely different. It essentially puts whatever context, whatever piece of code that you're saying to run after that amount of time, and does it completely separate from where you just invoked that function. Essentially, it's like, hey, at some point in the future, handle this, but don't stop what is currently executing. And that really caught me by surprise the first couple times that I used it when my code was essentially not working in the order that I thought it should.
Yeah, I've experienced the same myself. And the other thing, just to tag on the set timeout one, is that whatever time that's passed, like in milliseconds, isn't actually a guarantee of the operation being done. It's just a guarantee that it's going to get added to the queue. And then if there's other stuff in front of it in the queue, it has to wait for those other things to complete. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, that was totally the first thing that I thought too was,
Oh yeah.
was set timeout. I mean, if you're not used to using promises and promise resolves and async awaits, then those can be confusing. I definitely, this is going to date me too. I did a lot of Cold Fusion back in the day and was in a lot of Cold Fusion groups, and I had more than one conversation with folks talking about what was actually going on with promises and resolving them, because that was just a mind-blowing concept. I think a lot of languages at this point have adopted the async await pattern, which simplifies that vastly, but at some point, if you are going to continue along JavaScript, you would have to learn a little bit more about promises and how to resolve those. And they work very well together once you understand that.
Yeah. As the old joke goes, despite the name, there are four things that Java and JavaScript have in common: J, A, V, and A.
Right.
So yeah, if you're coming from a synchronous IO language, don't let the similarity in the syntax make you think it's a similar language. It's very much not. Now,
What is the other phrase? Java is to car, whereas JavaScript is to carpet.
yeah. So a lot of people, Jessica, you mentioned you've been doing JavaScript since jQuery was cool. I've also been doing JavaScript since jQuery was cool. I remember being excited that I suspect there's an awful lot of people whose knowledge of JavaScript ends with jQuery is cool. So what are some of the more exciting things that people who are not paying attention to the JavaScript space may not realize? Oh, I can do that
Right.
in JavaScript.
Sure. So I definitely was this person several years ago. I was probably in the upper echelon for knowing just about all there was to know about jQuery. And I think the thing that is a little bit of a hurdle for people to get over is that JavaScript has really taken a lot of cues from jQuery and integrated a ton of that stuff into the language itself. And it's no longer super necessary to use jQuery. There are definitely things it makes easier. Definitely, no arguments there. But there comes a point where you realize, is it really worth the like 90K for this library so that I can chain things easier or whatever it is you were using it for? And at least for me, I started getting away from jQuery. I would go to youmightnotneedjquery.com and type in the thing I knew in jQuery, and it would pop up and be like, oh, it's a 2-liner now. I can just use that, or even a 1-liner.
I love that site when it came out. Yeah.
Oh yes, that was a huge help, and at least for me, getting over the like maybe I don't need jQuery as much. And I mean, for me, the biggest thing was adding query selectors and query selector all, which is, I mean, it's identical to the like $, and then you put the CSS syntax in there and it pulls that stuff out. That was super helpful. Doing a lot of like better stuff with looping and selecting things inside of arrays also was super helpful. And really native support for doing Ajax that is not the worst thing in the entire universe was like the biggest selling point of all. You can just do fetch now. It's even easier than jQuery. So those were probably three of the things that helped me the most, getting a little more away from jQuery and into just vanilla JavaScript or frameworks or whatever.
Right, and there are some pretty concrete advantages to taking the time to learn the native JavaScript stuff over jQuery now, because especially as JavaScript is moving further and further into platform. jQuery, a lot of it will still work in your platform side of stuff, but a significant portion of it is not built for the platform. So you're talking about bringing a 90K library for like maybe 1/5 of the functionality, and that 1/5 of the functionality already exists in native JavaScript. So pushing yourself to learn more than just jQuery and starting to understand some of the underlying native stuff that is supported now is going to be a great advantage.
know, for me, when I felt JavaScript was really useful and usable for me as a non-JavaScript developer primarily was ES6, when they added native class syntax and um, async await and things like that. That like, oh, I understand. I understood JavaScript's object model in the past, but I didn't actually understand it well enough to use it effectively, which I think was true for the majority of the developer community, which is why they added native classes, even though it's just syntactic sugar. So I know for me, that was one of the big turning points of, oh, this is actually a thing now.
Yeah, that is a great point. JavaScript's not really class model before was definitely confusing if that's not what you were raised on, for lack of better phrasing.
Yeah, you can do the kind of more traditional, I'm using air quotes here, object-oriented type code now in JavaScript, and it more or less works. Yeah. So that's
definitely some gotchas, but that doesn't usually happen until you're really into the language, and then you can Google it and understand what it's saying. So,
so you mentioned that JavaScript's been moving to the platform side. You're talking there about Node.js and server-side JavaScript, which has been around for a number of years, and is its own ecosystem as well. So JavaScript is really the only viable language on the browser side. Everything else that you do is going to compile to JavaScript one way or another. But server-side, you have Node.js for server-side JavaScript, which is one of a plethora of server-side languages available. Talk to us a bit about Node, what some of its advantages are vis-a-vis other languages on the server side. Why would you use JavaScript on the back end as well?
I'll let you start with this one. I know you've been doing a lot of Node recently.
So I think at least for what we have encountered at our company, one of the largest advantages by far is having a shared language that goes up and down the entire stack. Developers can become experts in JavaScript, and they're going to be able to understand, read, debug, and contribute to every single one of our repositories, no matter where it is in the stack. In addition, because of how developers have been handling the fact that people are using JavaScript in both the web and platform in regards to writing their libraries, there are just an absolutely large amount of libraries out there that work on both platform and in the browser. So if your company or your group picks out a variety of libraries, util libraries or other request libraries that you use on both the browser and the backend, you can also become experts in those and not have to have additional knowledge outside of that necessarily to be able to work anywhere in the stack. It allows you to have consistency in your language or in your repositories. It allows you to have consistency among your developers and a shared understanding that you can speak to.
So that is another thing I wanted to ask about. Just how distinct are the front end and back end ecosystems?
They're very similar. They're both built on the V8 engine that Chrome uses. So they're literally using the same thing under the hood. And I mean, Node.js really is just adding in like some file system stuff that JavaScript obviously is not able to do.
Don't forget Firefox here.
Oh, yes, and Firefox. Firefox is so good. Yeah, they're super similar. And I think one thing that I really like about Node and we're probably going to cover this at some point anyway, but I really appreciate that I feel like the barrier to entry for Node is so much lower, because it's not like, let's pick one of these 6,000 frameworks and just go for it. And then you not only are learning the language itself, but also a framework on top of it. And sometimes it's hard to disentangle. Node is very much just like, you're going to write pure JavaScript, and it's typically pretty up-to-date JavaScript. You don't have to worry about like transpiling it or getting some crazy framework involved. You can just write JavaScript and get started, and it actually does something very quickly out the gate.
But now there are server-side frameworks available for Node, though, correct?
Yes, absolutely there are. I mean, obviously, like Express is probably the number one out there.
Yeah, that I can think of anyways.
Yeah, for sure. And those are going to help you for sure as well. I mean, Express is great for doing like APIs. That's kind of where it lives. And it's basically just like a server engine. So, but even that is really just kind of, it's lightweight. Like you're still going to be doing pretty much exclusively real JavaScript that's going to translate to the web if you wanted to get into that. Whereas like, if you learn React, you're going to learn a lot of JSX, which is pretty exclusive to React. And if you don't know that that is like part of JavaScript and what you're doing with it, can be a little confusing.
Yeah, it looks like magic.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't understand what's happening underneath using some of the front-end frameworks, it just looks like magic. And then if you ever have to swap, it's like, I guess I'll relearn everything again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've dabbled a bit in some front-end frameworks, and yeah, they're each their own programming language that happens to have JavaScript under the hood.
Sure.
Which is actually another good question. JavaScript, by reputation, is kind of famous, or maybe infamous, for having lots of frameworks. I think in the time we've been broadcasting so far, there have been 3 new JavaScript frameworks released, 2 of them named after vegetables.
That sounds right.
So given that, realistically, if you're trying to get into JavaScript, front end or back end, I guess that's 2 separate questions, front end and back end. What frameworks or tool chains are actually worth learning? Which ones actually have market share and staying power that are going to be more than just a flavor of the week? Which ones are worth the investment?
I'll start on this because I think Austin's going to have a lot to say too. But I definitely have a strong bias for learning Vue because the barrier to entry for that is exceptionally low. One of the things that's super intimidating, and I know it's even intimidating for me who's been doing this for many years, is like, how do I get started if I want to use JavaScript on the front end? Because you go and look at these blogs and it's like, okay, well, you can't really start writing JavaScript yet because you've got to set up your environment and you've got to learn Node to install everything. And you need to go ahead and start this framework setup. It's so much stuff, it's overwhelming. But the thing I really love about Vue and what they've got set up is you can just install Vue. It has abstracted all the other crap that isn't learning how to write JavaScript, and you just like type one little command and you're off. They've got all of that set up for you so you can get started. And they do a really good job of letting you just write HTML, CSS, and actual JavaScript that looks like real JavaScript. So you're learning what that, sorry, somebody's calling me. Oh, it's my mom. Okay, sorry, Mom. You're actually learning stuff that you can take other places when you're doing Vue. And I mean, on top of that, I just like it generally anyway. It uses JSX under the hood, so it's pretty fast. So I think that's a great one to get started if you're just thinking like, oh my gosh, I just want to get started. Please get me through all of these stupid 400 things I have to do to even write one line of JavaScript. It gets you past all of that very quickly. And a lot of companies do use it. It's definitely a very portable or framework that's been around for a while. So that's my vote. And of course, React is the other one that everybody should probably look into at some point these days.
Right. So I have 2 competing thoughts on this one. I personally believe that when people are fresh out the gate and have not really worked in JavaScript or HTML or CSS, what they should do is do it like we did in the old days without a build system. And they should have a JavaScript file, and they should have an HTML file and a CSS file, and learn what these things are actually doing before jumping into Vue or React, which I personally love Vue a lot, but I think that unfortunately its level of magic that it does for you leads you to not understanding what some of the underlying things are actually doing. If you understand JavaScript and the DOM model and how those 2 things interact with each other, when you then move to a framework like React or Vue or whatever you want to use, you're going to understand the concepts that it's presenting to you and making easier for you because you did it the hard way, or at least the native way. So I always promote people to go out and build small things, just build really small web pages, start to understand your CSS, start to understand some of your basic JavaScript with your event listeners and your click handlers, and start to understand the basics of HTML. And then once you're done with that, yeah, I think a great idea is to go download the Vue CLI and start a simple project. Like Jessica said, there's a one-liner. There is technically the same thing for React, but I wouldn't recommend it as much for a new person because Vue allows you to still use all the skills you just built with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, whereas with React, you do have to learn JSX. So that's what I'd say. Start basic, learn, then use the magic.
And for anyone out there that may not be familiar with JSX, and I really like that contrast that you draw, because I think that that's one of the biggest differences between, let's say, Vue, as you mentioned, and some other JS frameworks, though I think Vue is probably one of the most popular of that style now. How does that syntactically differ from what gets wrapped in the main return function in a JSX component?
So in Vue, if you're using the single file components, it allows you to write actual sections in the file. One's your HTML, one is your just normal native JavaScript, and another is your straight up CSS. It's all in one place. It's a really nice model of doing that. And it actually looks like if you took those three things and split them into their own files, they could live as an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file with no changes. Whereas in React and with JSX, when you are actually writing out the JSX, it looks like you're writing a JavaScript string. And that is essentially a combination of HTML and JavaScript in the exact same place. And for people who don't understand what's happening underneath, that's going to be a little bit more complicated because it's not just raw HTML and JavaScript at that point. You are essentially concatenating strings together on the fly in your JavaScript code to build up HTML. For anyone who's actually worked in like a language like PHP or other server-side rendering applications, it might make a little bit more sense because it looks like you're actually concatenating HTML together at that point, but I don't recommend it for beginners.
Was your question, how does it wrap? Like how does the JSX get converted?
Well, no, I think that was actually a good summary of my initial question, but that's where I was going to go with it. Is for someone who's familiar with, I really like that initial suggestion you made of people learning basic HTML, vanilla JavaScript, like how do files get imported, all that stuff initially. For someone who's gone through that, can you summarize what is going on with JSX or even a Vue component, because they get translated to similar things under the hood, and give a good summary of how that differs from what is actually existing in the DOM when you view source in the browser?
Ooh, very high level. That's turned into an interview question.
Sorry.
I'm just kidding. No, so I think, like I said before, Vue uses JSX under the hood, which is the same thing that React uses. And they both use a very similar principle. And I'm assuming a lot of people watching this don't know a ton about higher level, like what makes doing stuff on a web page very efficient. And one of the things that is really efficient when you're doing stuff on a web page is not manipulating the DOM until you have to. And there's several ways that you can do that to make it even more efficient. And the reason that is because whenever the DOM is changed in any way, it's essentially saying, okay, you have to just recalculate literally everything, just rerun all the code, figure out where everything's supposed to be, show it again. Clearly, if you're hearing that, you're like, well, that doesn't sound efficient. So for like classic JavaScript developers, like maybe I was a long time ago with jQuery, for example, you had to pay a lot of attention to like, okay, I have a list of 100 items and I need to update all of them. I could loop over every single one of them and update every single one in order, and it's going to be very slow because it's pulling each one off, changing it, putting it back, doing a repaint, and going down all 100 of those. The really more efficient thing is going to be pull the entire list as it is in the DOM change everything, and then put it back, because then it's only one repaint for all 100 or whatever of those. Now, Jsx React, I think everybody knows, was from Facebook, and they were, of course, they're a huge company. They have this huge site. They were facing this problem of very efficient repaints or inefficient repaints, and of course, there's code everywhere. So they came up with this system with React and JSX, where it kind of makes like a copy of the DOM in a thing called a shadow DOM. And it looks at that, and whenever you make a change, it takes that change and looks at the shadow DOM and says, okay, well, here's the most efficient way to make this change on the actual web page. And then it makes that change instead of trying to figure it out on the fly or let you, the developer, have that in your hands, because not that many people know how to do that super efficiently. And then it makes that update for you to make that very, very efficient. I think that's the way I understand it. I might have gotten a couple of pieces wrong. Do you have anything to add?
So it allows you as a developer to think in terms of, I'm going to iterate the items and update them, and it'll smartly batch that and figure out the most efficient way of then repainting it when it makes sense to do so.
Correct. And I think it even uses like some of the like timing that people like mentally have on it. I think you've got like what, 36 milliseconds or something to do whatever you want.
Right. There's a trick in, so a browser displays at 60 frames per second. And if you break that down, if you divide 1,000 milliseconds by 60 frames, you get, I don't remember the number, but a certain amount of milliseconds per frame to do something. You can do whatever you want in the DOM in that amount of time, and it will not affect the frame rate of the browser. So you can do straight up magic to the DOM to do animations and set them up and let them play out afterwards, as long as you do it within that amount of time. That's one of the things that frameworks do take a lot of advantage of, is waiting until waiting until the last frame happened, doing a lot of calculations, putting the stuff into the DOM, and then letting the next frame happen. And it does do the repaint, but it does it with the new frame that's coming out to help reduce, jitteriness due to a lack of reducing the frame rate of the browser.
Right.
Cool. Yeah, I knew there was a lot of black magic going on the performance side there. I didn't realize it had to do with that, like matching up to time slots.
Well, I mean, that is how it does animations. A lot of the frameworks come with like built-in animation functions, which is amazing. And it is definitely black magic. And what he just described is how they're able to accomplish that in a very efficient manner.
Yeah, that if anyone has written Vue code and used transition or transition group, which are these custom elements built into Vue, that's exactly how they work. Essentially, like, for example, a transition group, you have a list of components in there, and if one pops out or moves around in that list, like say you reorder it, a transition group provided to you by Vue can automatically show the animation of all that reshuffling. And it does that using the 36 millisecond trick I was just explaining, where essentially it updates the DOM immediately, takes a snapshot of where all those elements would go to, and then it uses some fun CSS tricks to force them back to their previous locations and lets the browser animate them to where they actually are now. And it does all of that calculation in less than the time of one frame of the browser. So you don't actually see it jump to the final destination and then move back. It just looks like it's at the previous destination and slowly animates to the new one.
And pushing the actual animation off to CSS lets the browser then push that off to your graphics card, and you get all the fun hardware acceleration that way.
Exactly.
Okay. I think we've gone pretty far down that nerd hole, but it was fun. Yeah, I learned things there. So coming back up a bit, you mentioned Vue as a good first framework. React is the big kid on the block. Have you worked with any of the super lightweight frameworks like Mithril or Svelte? I haven't done much with those, but I've liked the concept. I don't know if you've worked with any of those. If you have thoughts on those?
I've just done Riot, which I hated.
So
Riot, okay.
Yeah, so there was a framework before called Riot that was similar-ish, but I have worked a little bit with Svelte, nothing in a production environment. But The conceptual concept is nice in that for those of you who don't know what Svelte is, it promises the idea that instead of having to ship the entire Vue or React library, the runtime, down to the browser to do all the magic we just discussed, the idea behind Svelte is, what if we only take the parts out of the Svelte library that we need to actually build the website? More so than like tree shaking, it actually builds non-generic code whenever you're doing your build that's specific for your site, instead of sending the entire runtime, which is generic and can do everything, right? So it's great in concept. I really actually do like it in concept. The problem for me is if you start building a big website, you're going to lose that advantage. Because one of the advantages of sending a generic runtime down is no matter how big your website gets, the size of the library runtime does not get any bigger. It's static. For smaller sites, that's a problem because a lot of your payload is the library. But for massive e-commerce sites, the majority of your payload is the actual website. So for Svelte, if you have a small site, you're sending a small amount down for the library itself. But if you are 2 years into the project writing Svelte, then all of your website is generating all of this Svelte code, and you've lost that advantage.
Because you're co-generating kind of materialized versions of everything.
Yes.
Got
exactly.
it. Okay. That's an interesting trade-off. Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit and switch back over to the server side for a while, to Node. So we mentioned Express as one of the big name frameworks on the server side. What are some others that people should be aware of if they're doing server-side JavaScript?
You mean like for literally like building a server, or just any
Yeah,
old...
like if you're doing server-side JavaScript with Node.js, Express, you can do vanilla Node.js. Express is one of the popular frameworks built on Node. What are some others that people should have on their radar?
I don't know.
Okay. I do have some information on it. So we primarily use either Express if we're writing a Node container or a Node server. But if we're not doing a REST API, like because we're using AWS's API gateway, we won't use that scenario. But let's say we are using Express. Some of the other tools that we end up using are like JSON validators. I remember it's called Joy is the one that we use, and which is JOI. And it allows you to define what's called JSON schema. And JSON schema essentially is you saying, hey, I know that I'm going to be getting a JSON payload. Maybe someone's putting or posting some object that you need to store in a database, and you want to validate that it's in the format that you expect it to be. JSON schema allows you to define that format very specifically, and there are libraries out there that will take the object given to you. You can put the schema into it, and it will say either yes, it's good, or no, it's not, and here are the like 18,000 reasons why. And you can ship those 18,000 reasons why back to the developer that in terms of like responding on the endpoint with a 400 or whatever. That is proven to be amazing. For us as developers, because our platform engineers can build exactly what they expect, and we don't have to be like, hey, I don't understand this. You didn't give me an error code, or you didn't give me an error status back in regards to this 400. I need you to look at the logs. Instead, it's all self-serve, and it's also self-validating, which is awesome.
Basically fixing some of the problems that object-oriented languages have a little bit easier time of.
Right.
I'd like to tag on a couple of things here that are maybe, I don't know if they're super popular libraries or not, actually. And this doesn't necessarily relate to servers, but more server side or whatever, JavaScript. And one thing that I've really started to enjoy writing JavaScript for is like little scripts that I would normally write in Bash or some other language, whether it be PHP or Python. And two libraries that I really like for just sort of making it a little bit nicer. One is Jsx, which allows you to, it doesn't do anything that Node cannot do natively, but it makes passing arguments to any script that you do write a little bit nicer to deal with. And the other one is Chalk, which allows you to do pretty outputs of any scripts that you write directly to your console. And then actually a third one, if one was to write a web scraper, if you did have to write one, I'm not
to be encourage this.
I'm not condoning, I disavow, any nefarious behavior, but if you had to write one, Cheerio is actually a library that can be beneficial. And to circle back to the jQuery stuff at the beginning, what Cheerio basically is a way to parse HTML on the server side in a jQuery-like syntax. Now, what it is not is it's not an actual execution of the JavaScript on that page. So it's not like Phantom.js or anything where the JavaScript is actually executed server side, and any JavaScript that would manipulate that DOM is, the DOM is updated. It's just a straight parsing of any HTML that it gets. So if you do like a fetch request and you get HTML back, it can parse that and you can get output from it. So yeah, those are a couple that I don't hear mentioned enough, but I think that writing little scripts and stuff with Node can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, right on.
We'll make sure to add those to the show notes.
Yeah, those are awesome. I didn't realize you were asking for just generally anything for Node. I thought you were talking about just for server creation. I was
Any of the above.
Stress.
Any of the above.
Well, to add on to what Thomas was saying, because I love both of those, or all three of those libraries. Those are all awesome. I do a lot of CLI writing in Node, and I use Commander for that pretty regularly. Commander, there's another one too.
Captain. Isn't it Captain?
No, that's that crappy one.
That's right. No, okay, yeah. So no, I know that you use Commander.
No, I use Commander for writing CLIs, and I mean, that's one of those things that is a great way to use Node and JavaScript and get started on, in my opinion, because there's always those little things that you're just like, man, I just wish that I personally could just run this whatever it is and it could do some sorcery for me. And so I've got like a local CLI that I run all the time for, I don't know, logging myself into AWS or getting an auth token for getting to some services or something like that. And it's fantastic for that. And using Yargs and, oh my goodness, Chalk are both fantastic for adding into CLIs and making those a lot easier to, to look at and deal with.
Now, one of the other nice things about Node is it quite similarly to Java is cross-platform. There is a Node binary for every single platform out there. So when you write your Node code and you put it into like NPM or whatever your favorite way to distribute your code is, and someone on any platform pulls it down, it's going to work. So you can write cross-platform CLIs pretty trivially that way. That's the way I write all my CLIs now. Back to what you were saying, yeah, I don't use Bash for basically anything now because the asynchronous model in Node is so much easier to deal with than trying to pipe around curls and other stuff like that.
All right, so we do have a question from the audience, from one Otavio Santana. You may have heard of him. He asks, what is the difference between Deno and Node.js?
Oh, I got this one.
Good, because I don't know what he's talking about, so have at it.
I got you. So Deno, if you'll notice, is spelled with the exact same letters as Node. That's on purpose. Essentially, Node was written quite a while ago, before Typescript really took off, before we had async await, before we even have really promises. It was all based on callbacks. And a lot of the native APIs are based on that. And they've added things to make it easier to deal with promises and to promisify callback functions and async await and all this other good stuff. But the idea behind Deno was to start fresh using the async await model for everything, to give it better support than kind of tacked on support. But more specifically, it was also to allow TypeScript to be a native language in the executable. The way that you use TypeScript right now, whether it's for the browser, oh, sorry, I'll back up. For those of you who don't know what TypeScript is, it is a superset of JavaScript that adds in typing, like that which you would see in like C#. So instead of things being like wibbly wobbly gook, that you don't really know what the data is coming in unless your developers add a lot of documentation, please add your documentation. But TypeScript allows you to define for every variable, for every function, for every returned value, what the types are that it expects and what's coming back out of it. So to have really concrete types at compile time. That's great and all, but for it to actually run on anything, browser or Node, it has to be compiled into JavaScript, which if you then have to debug that, can be a little tricky because you don't always have TypeScript available and the code that it generates is not one-to-one. So the idea behind Deno was to fix that problem, make TypeScript an actual language that can be executed by a platform binary natively, instead of taking your TypeScript, compiling it to JavaScript, and then shoving it into Node. So it's a variety of making things more modern, bringing in TypeScript, security updates, stuff like that. And if I remember right, it's actually written by the guy who originally started Node. So there's that.
Yeah, I think that that's correct. And I remember hearing a quote from him and his name slipping my mind. I think he said something to the effect of, now I'm paraphrasing here, is Deno is what Node would be if he wrote it today instead of X number of years ago. If he had to write Node all over today, this is what it would be. So
JavaScript seems to have a lot of those. The language evolves so fast these days that, like I've described Mithril as what React would have been if React was written 5 years later.
Right.
And it sounds like Deno is the same kind of idea. And that sounds really interesting. So that's an alternate runtime engine. So I'll ask, my boss will probably hate me for asking this without telling him first. So should we add a Deno container as first class support at Platform alongside Node and PHP and Python and everything else?
I personally want to see it gain adoption. But I think even on the GitHub page, they say maybe don't use it for production builds yet. So I will not advise one way or another. I personally am experimenting with it in my personal time, but we do not use it at a company yet, specifically for the fact that it is new. AWS does not support it yet, which is a big killer for us. But
we should just host on Platform instead.
Yeah, I mean, we could spin up containers, sure, but I really like my Lambdas, so I got to do what they give me. I could spin up custom runtime, but that's a whole different story.
I have to give you a tour of Platform after the show is over.
Oh boy!
Yes.
Okay, so that sounds fascinating. I think we'll tuck that away in the back of our heads and possibly look at that later, because I like the idea of TypeScript as a first class support. That really appeals to me because I'm a typing fan. So the lack of typing in native JavaScript bothers me.
I think you are not alone there. I actually meant to say something about it way earlier. That is a thing that just like ichinates many people when including this one.
Yep.
I started him on JavaScript and he was like, "Oh, gross! I don't like that it doesn't type anything."
Yeah, I went from 7 years of Java to JavaScript and being like, I have no types.
What am I supposed to do with this? This is hard. So TypeScript.
My experience is people either want to go all the way to Haskell type systems or all the way to completely.
Something I also have experience with.
No one wants to be in the middle. Everyone wants to go completely one direction or the other.
Right.
And I am a gunslinger. I can definitely do typing. I love that it is a thing. I understand the benefits of it. And I think one of the things we each thought about talking about was like, what is JavaScript and Node and stuff good for versus not? And I think that really,
segue.
That really for me is the thing that delineates where it's not good. If you've got a very complex system where typing is going to be critical, and you really need to make sure that everything is typed really, really strongly, and there's a very strong delineation between those, then that is not probably the best thing that you could do in Node. You could do it, I think there's other languages out there that are going to be better suited to your needs, though.
Or money. Don't use money in Node unless you use a library very specifically built for it, because
Oh my gosh,
it
yeah.
will bite you when you do division or multiplication.
And to be fair, I'd say that in most languages, don't try to handle money yourself. Use libraries that are designed for that. It's like date time handling. No sane person does that themselves. That's what libraries written by professionals are for.
I think the only language that I've felt semi-comfortable dealing with money myself was C# because of its decimal type. It's what it's like literally built for. It's the only one I know that exists, so I'm just going to use the libraries for everything else.
I mean, JavaScript doesn't even have big ints, so
It does now.
It's emerging.
Yes.
It's in phase 1. I think it's got to go through 4 phases to get adopted. So I wouldn't recommend that.
Yeah. So that's a, as I said, a good segue to the next question I wanted to ask, which would be, if you're starting a new project, greenfield, on the server side, client side, don't have a choice. What type of project would you look at and go, oh, totally, this is a Node project. It needs to be a Node project. And what type of project would you say, please don't use Node for this, use this other thing instead? And what's that other thing? So I guess 2 questions for both of you.
So you're saying if you have to use Node?
No. New project, should I use
someone
Node?
brings you a project and says, what type of project would you say, oh, of course I'm going to do this one in Node. Why else? What else?
So I think a lot of projects would do well with Node. I'll talk about the ones that it's good for. Well, maybe I'll talk about the ones it's not good for, since I pretty much just covered that. If you've got a really big project that is very, very complex, like the company, we actually both work for the same company, that's how we met. They do a lot of very complex processing of like coupon promotions. It's unbelievable how complex this stuff is. That is a terrible way to use Node because there's just so many things that if you get even like a character that's capitalized incorrectly, it throws the whole chain off. Or there's like microservices that are dependent on others, and it's this very long chain. That would probably not be a great place to use Node. There are a lot of languages. Java's great for that. .NET is great for that. Maybe C#.
C#.NET, but yeah,
right.
I think if you need strict contracts is the way I'd phrase that. I'm not sure that I would use Node, or if you do use Node, please use something like Joy, some kind of Java JSON object validator to enforce what you would get in another language, which makes me question if you should be using Node in that scenario. Additionally, something like two things that come to mind are APIs that are doing a lot of processing, like image processing API. Probably
CPU intensive tasks.
Yeah, should probably not be written in Node because going back to what we were talking about with the asynchronous model stuff, if something is actively working and it's not paused so that something else can work, if it's actively working and very CPU intensive, nothing else in Node is going to be able to run until it has like a pause or a break. So like OCR and other CPU intensive like search algorithms or translation algorithms, stuff like that is not going to be a good fit for Node, simply for that fact, like other things cannot run at the same time while this is running, and it's going to be CPU intensive. Whereas flip side to that, like a REST API that's returning objects out of a database, or making simple file returns, like you request a file and it lets you download it, or like logging things, stuff like that. You can get more complex than that, but essentially things that aren't CPU intensive and aren't going to lock up that thread doing some kind of complex algorithm is great for Node, because that's what it's built for. It's built to be able to do these small packets of work and like hundreds of thousands of them at the same time.
I would also say, continue.
To that point, I've usually seen it summarized as Node is really good at IO intensive tasks because of the async model, and really bad at CPU intensive tasks because of the async model.
Yeah, that is very correct.
Okay.
There's something else I was going to say about Node. Oh, I do also really enjoy using Node for I guess like things that need to get off the ground very, very, very fast, because if you are comfortable with loose typing, that's great. You can just go to town very quickly and get something out the door that your developers can use and call very, very quickly. I mean, you can go from 0 to API in like under an hour and have like CRUD stuff going. So
Easily.
yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic thing for doing proof of concepts, things like that. Once you get just a little bit familiar with it, it goes lightning fast.
So we have a few more questions from the audience here. Carlos M asks, he has 2 questions. I'll first ask, doesn't Node.js run several threads?
So do you want to handle this? Or, yeah, okay.
Sounds like there's an asterisk in this answer either way. So.
There is and there isn't. So Node.js runs, depending on how you have it configured, it can run 1 or more processes. And technically, you can mentally map that to 1 or more threads. But the important bit is that there's this concept, trying not to get deep into it, because like you said, we could talk about it forever. There's this concept called the event loop, where it picks something off of a queue, runs that piece of code, and when that piece of code is done, it stops and picks up something else off the queue and runs that. So it's technically a single thread that is actually executing stuff. But Node does give you the opportunity to, recently, I think as of like Node 12, they introduced something called workers or worker threads, where you can actually make Node multi-threaded in the way that we think of Java and C# as being multi-threaded. It takes that event loop model and essentially duplicates it. So you have all your normal code running on, the main thread, and then you spin up a worker thread and you spit other JavaScript into that, and that has its own event loop to work on. So at that point, it becomes multi-threaded, but only if you specifically spin up a new worker to do it. Whenever you're just using normal Node or browser JavaScript, it technically is a single thread that is picking up work, doing it, and then picking up additional work off the queue once the previous work was completed.
And one thing I'd like to tag on there is to put an additional asterisk is both, though they're named slightly different things, both Node on the server side and also browsers. I think all major browsers support them, and browsers they're called service workers. So you can actually break off a service worker in the browser. Again, client side, we're not talking anything running on a server, client side, to actually break off, sort of a CPU thread. Again, it gets very fuzzy because the browser's handling the host is handling all the logic for what happens there. But that's a way to say I want to dedicate, additional CPU resources to this task, which we actually use in some of our work at Platform. So,
yeah. Okay. And Carlos also asks, I'm an old guy learning on JavaScript. So TypeScript is like good old Pascal. Variable types must match in pointers and references. So I guess TypeScript could be its own episode, but is there a short answer to that?
Pascal. So I don't have any experience with Pascal.
What was the question? It sounded like he was just saying that's what it is.
There's question marks in there. I just didn't say them aloud. Carlos, feel free to correct me. I think it's more, so TypeScript, it's typed JavaScript. What does that mean? Is it, if I'm used to a typed language where I've got my manual pointers and ints and floats and so on, is that what we're talking about?
Right. So there's not pointers. It's more like if you've ever worked in C# or Java, which if you've not, this unfortunately will not mean as much. But if you have, it's very similar to that. Yeah, well, you're right, because there's stronger typing in classes in PHP, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you've worked in any of those, remove the pointers, and you've got a similar thing where that you essentially you can define actual types, whether that's classes or just random objects, and you define the actual type of it and the properties that are in it. And when you define a function, you say what types it will accept, and then you also define what type it's going to return. And the compiler will actually tell you if you have set a property on an object to the wrong value, like you set it as a string when it should have been a number, or vice versa, or you provided one type to a function when it should have been a different kind of type, and it'll save you essentially from the problem that you can encounter in JavaScript, which is I wrote this function, it normally accepts a number, but you had value coming in from a user typing on the keyboard that you forgot to convert to a number. So now it's actually a string and you passed it and nothing protected you from that. And now your code's in prod and it exploded because it tried to do a math thing on string.
And
Wow,
bad things happen.
That was stressful.
Things that have happened.
I do want to add, I don't know if we actually cover this or even need to, but JavaScript in its pure form doesn't need to be compiled. But we are saying we need to compile these because JavaScript often you have to add a lot of crap in to make it actually run on the browsers, all of them consistently. I mean, part of the reason it's so discombobulated and has like strange namings for things or whatever is because it's still trying to support IE6 in China or whatever. So
does anyone still care about IE6? Please tell me the answer is no.
The answer is no, but there's a part of our company that still supports IE8.
Yeah.
So
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Me too.
Yeah, I'm glad I don't have to work on that. That was fun. I spent several years trying to support IE6 in Quirks mode at a previous job. Anyway, most JavaScript, you do have to run some kind of compilation using, typically you're going to use a tool like Babel. And that's very good at compiling that down and only including the stuff that needs to be included. But if you're going to use TypeScript, you're going to also have to compile whatever you use to write TypeScript down into just plain old boring JavaScript. It's just a thing to add if you're getting into the universe of JavaScript and are confused.
But if you start with the basics, like I suggested, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, you don't have to do that. You can just play around with modern JavaScript in like Chrome while you learn. And then whenever you do have to support IE2, then Babel will save you.
Yeah, major browser-side JavaScript these days is in that weird place where it's an interpreted language that you need to compile before you can run it, which is just weird.
Yeah.
Right. The thing that helps me break that mental model is calling it transpiling instead of compiling. You're actually taking your code and translating it into like an older version of it. But
yeah. All right. Well, we're just about at time, so I have one last question for you before we let you go. Is the S in JavaScript capitalized? My spell checker and I disagree about this.
Would you like to get?
Well, I think you Googled this because you were like, I don't know. I don't capitalize it because I'm lazy. I mean, efficient, but I.
Per Wikipedia.
The source of all knowledge.
Right. And definitely not opinionated in any way. It is supposed to be a capital J and a capital S, and they're supposed to be together. That being said, I do not write that ever. I don't think I've ever written it that way. It is either capitalized J and then it's all lowercase, or it's just all lowercase across the board because I can't be bothered. But I think it technically is supposed to be JavaScript.
Okay, so my spell checker is correct, but I still agree with Jessica about being lazy. I mean efficient.
I'm glad you didn't ask how to pronounce GIF.
Oh my gosh.
Let's not get into that. We'd be here for another hour.
Right.
All right. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I would say, yeah, definitely do. There are a lot of resources out there, including the ones by Mozilla. Its developer network that you can find and learn basically everything that you need to know about JavaScript, both for platform and especially for the web. And if you start really digging into those resources, it's going to help you more than just for JavaScript, especially if you're on the web. And I would highly advise taking time to Google it and not be scared of it. People are out there and they're going to help you, and it's great. It's a great language to know and use.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us, especially you, Austin, for joining us on such short notice. It's been great having you here. Thank you, Jessica, for agreeing to come on. And thank you, everyone at home, for joining us on this episode of Deploy Friday. We will be back next week at the same time to talk about accessibility, which is kind of a thing. Everyone should be paying attention to it. Not enough do. So tune in next week and we will talk more about the ins and outs and the whys and the wherefores and other interrogative statements about accessibility. Until then, take care, be well, and go deploy your site today because Friday is an excellent time to deploy. Thank you, everyone, and take care. We're done. Yay.